Hello everybody and welcome to a deck building video. As I said in the showcase video that I put up a few days ago, it's deck building time for Suzi the Slime. So I built this deck on a recent stream, and the video is actually currently live for all of our patrons. So if you want to join us on Patreon, down in the description, you can see kind of my active thought process as I'm building. But I have the deck here that I wanted to touch on and kind of just my first theory crafting, so to speak, for this print and play investigator that I'm probably not going to play too often, if like more than once or twice. She's fun. She's very fun, but she's print and play. So as far as I'm concerned, she ain't even real. So what do we got here? Let's look at her cards. So Suzi, subject 5U21, hereby known as Suzi, has ones across the board for her stats. You begin the game with Ravenous Controlled Hunger in play. During each upkeep phase, draw one additional card and devour a non-weakness player card in your hand. As a Lightning Bolt, you can devour a non-story card controlled by an investigator location, limit once per round. Elder Sign effect +2. After this test ends, you may add a devoured card to its owner's hand. Pretty sick. So the backside is a 50-card deck, so it's pretty damn big. And then also that 3 copies of Regurgitation, 3 copies of Reality Acid, and 2 random basic weaknesses. Deck building restrictions, no permanents except story and signature permanents. And then additional requirements, your deck must include at least 7 cards from each class, and then some upgrading, which we're not worrying about in this deck list here. Ravenous Controlled Hunger is if for each time you devour a card, place a face down beneath Ravenous. You get +1 to each of your skills for each card beneath Ravenous to a max of +5. If there are 5 or more cards beneath Ravenous, you flip it over into its uncontrolled hunger side, which is each time you devour a card, set it aside out of play, but you still get +1 to each of your skills for each card beneath Ravenous. So the difference between the controlled and uncontrolled version is that whenever you devour a card while you're uncontrolled, it doesn't boost your stats. So if you flipped into your uncontrolled hunger when you only had 3 cards beneath Suzi, you're going to stay only at 4s for your stats. You're not going to be able to devour more cards onto your controlled hunger. So that's annoying. And that's actually kind of the thing that I found was the fun balancing when I played Suzi, was that if your signature permanent flips early, you're kind of like, well, what the hell do I do now? And you have to kind of like start going down. How do you do that? Well, the forced effect on uncontrolled hunger, as you can see there. At the end of your turn, devour a non-story card beneath Ravenous or controlled by an investigator location. If there is nothing beneath Ravenous, you flip it over. So, when you're in your uncontrolled hunger, you can choose to devour from your Ravenous supply to bring you back down to 0 cards beneath your Ravenous. Or you can devour cards in your play area. So this was my first inkling of an idea for where Suzi should live. I thought that Suzi should have a lot of cheap assets that she can play during the setup portion of the game, that she then turns into fodder to allow her to stay in 6s for all of her stats for the last part of the game. This created a very interesting kind of push and pull, where at the start of the game you weren't really contributing anything, and then at the end of the game, you were contributing a lot. However, it was kind of at the detriment to Suzi and her teammates. You become very reckless as you're just trying to, eat and stay full. It's very fun and very interesting, and I'm curious to see and try it more. One thing to note, though, is that there's a lot of fun tricks that you can do with this, but you have to be very aware. If you're planning on upgrading your decks, it's always just the card you devour, the color or their class that you devour the most of, so you can't really control it. Her signature Regurgitation, they don't really matter for the deck here. They weren't really my thought process for what I was trying to do with Suzi. I did include them here in the video for your convenience, so you can kind of just see what Suzi's doing. But for me, when I built this Suzi deck, which you can find a link down in the description to a very Charlie Kane looking deck with all of the cards in it. Don't mind that. Just pretend that's Suzi, and then when Suzi actually gets on ARKHAM, if I remember, I'm going to transfer the deck over to an actual Suzi deck. So eventually one day, and hopefully this is no longer what I'm talking about here is relevant. But the Ravenous. My idea was cheap assets and card draw. That's where I felt like Suzi would be the best, because she would eat and then she would draw cards to make sure she doesn't run out of juice, because you have to devour one card from your hand each turn. Yes, you're drawing an additional card. However, if you're going to be playing assets and using those to eventually stop your Ravenous, or I guess like make your Ravenous happy because it's eating, you don't really get to, what's the word I'm looking for? You're going to run out of juice in your hand eventually. And anytime you draw one of your weaknesses, with your draw, you're actually not drawing a card. You're still going to be going, like, you're just going to stay neutral for your cards are. But I broke down these cards in this deck list into assets, events, and skills because we can kind of just see it. So why don't we jump in and look at the assets. So all the assets are here that are in the deck. And you'll notice that I built Suzi as a flex. I think it would be kind of disingenuous to build a Suzi deck that just tried to do one thing, because Suzi doesn't really want to do one thing. If you're only using your book stat to investigate and not using your fist or your brain or your foot or anything like that, what the hell are you doing with Suzi? Right? Like, that's kind of the strange thing about her. So I built a flex, and as you can see, I have a lot of cards that you otherwise would not normally want to play. Like Relentless, right? Like, why am I looking at Relentless here? Well, because it was a zero-cost Guardian asset that I can use to hit my 7 Guardian cards, which admittedly I did hit pretty fine on its own. But it's also something that you just spend an action to play. And this action, essentially, that you're doing now means that in the future, you do not need to worry about losing stats. So the turn to play Relentless, which there's no limit of, you can actually play both Relentlesses. It means that one action you play that Relentless means you have 3 additional actions in the future at 6s in all of your skills. So that's why I was kind of looking at it. Same with Forbidden Knowledge. Forbidden Knowledge, of course, has another effect as well. And because of Regurgitation, as we go back here, Regurgitation actually has like some good horror healing. So like that's another thing that you actually could get the additional resources that come from Forbidden Knowledge with that, and then heal that off later. Our weapons were Machete, Enchanted Blade. Enchanted Blade's nice because it eventually empties out of charges and then you just eat it. Yummy. Switchblade is fast. It's a 1-cost asset, so it's cheap and it's fast, and it takes up an asset slot that Suzi can then eat in the future. That was very important to me. And when you have 6s in your stats, you're probably going to hit with Switchblade. I know I did in the gameplay that I played with this, which we'll see up on the channel next week, next Tuesday, for people who might want to watch that. But as you can see, Switchblade was here to cover a lot of bases. It's a weapon, we can eat it, and it's fast and cheap, which means that, once again, if we go back to what I was saying about Relentless, an action now is 3 actions in the future. A fast action now isn't even an action. It's just like more in the future. Magnifying Glass fits into a similar role as Switchblade, as you can see before I go to our last weapon here. But it's fast, takes up a hand slot. We can eat it in the future and not regret it. The 18 Derringer was our last weapon that we have here. Again, you spend your ammo and then you eat it. Someone, when I was making this deck, was talking about a Doom idea for Suzi, and I think that's also a very fun idea. I think Suzi has a lot of ways that she can take advantage of her ability, because with Doom you can kind of just eat the cards afterwards. However, I didn't apply that here because I had a very specific idea that I wanted to build for Suzi, and that's what I did. Dr. Milan Christopher is here to give us more book and give us resources to play cards. He's our only ally in our deck, and we don't try to eat him, but if we have to eat him, dude has to get eaten. That's just how it goes. Lucky Cigarette Case, we are going to be succeeding by 2 a lot, so it just means more cards, and more cards means more things to eat. You want to stay card positive with Suzi, whether that be in your hand and your play area optimally, but also just hand is a good place as well. Old Keyring, you actually, so if you go to, it's a lightning bolt ability. I actually would devour the card. I would actually devour the card after I started the investigate action when there was only 1 key on it, which is kind of sick. Also notably, Scroll of Secrets as well, just cheap. Gets cards, it's empty, you eat it, really good. So a thing I want to talk about for Suzi here is in this deck, if you're going to try this one out and you want to play Suzi, what you're going to want to do is you're not going to want to use her ability until you're comfortable, right? So for how my game went is I had 3 cards beneath Ravenous, and then I drew a Reality Acid, which flips it over. I then ate down back to low stats, and then for the last part of the game, I went back up to 6s. And in that case, I went very aggressively on devouring my non-story, using the Lightning Bolt ability on Suzi. And the reason for that was because you don't want to get into your uncontrolled hunger until you have the juice to, like, keep eating. You, of course, could, right? Like, just start playing your Relentlesses when you're in your uncontrolled hunger. However, in my mind, I'd rather spend an action when I have 1s, 2s, or 3s in my stats than when I have 6s in my stats and just play more with my 6s. So that was kind of my thought process for that. On to our events. Pretty simple. You see here that these are kind of just, like, good cards. These are kind of just good cards, right? Like, Glory draws cards. Toe-to-toe, this could be something else. I just put in toe-to-toe because, you know, with 50-card decks, if you're not... You can't really rely on drawing what you want to draw when you want to draw it. So just having, like, an extra damage option was kind of how I looked at it. Burning the Midnight Oil gave you resources. Deep Knowledge gave us cards. Faustian gave us resources. Read the Sign and Spectral Razors are just damn good cards, especially when you're attacking at 12. However, even if you have 4s in your stats, attacking or investigating at 8 is really good. End of the road, because optimally at the end of the game is when we want to be our strongest. So an extra action at that time is really good, and the emergency cash, just more money. Skills here, again, pretty simple. These are just good skills. They're just good skills. Like, there's basically 1 of each color except for purple because... I mean, Promise of Power, but I don't think this deck needs Promise of Power. Optimally, you're going to be pretty quick at getting up to at least 3s, and you'll probably survive them. But yeah, as you can see, kind of like the deck idea was very simple. And the majority of the meat of the deck lives in these asset cards. Because the game plan was simple. Spend the first few turns when you're weak as hell putting assets out. And then eating those assets when you're strong as hell. And it was fun to play. And it did work. It did work. And, like, it was me. I built Suzi in an ARKHAM Pete deck. And I played the Waking Nightmare, the first of the companion side of Dream Eaters. And it went very well. And Suzi, she's interesting. Notably, I believe I ate the most Survivor cards, but I also ate a lot of, like, ARKHAM Pete Survivor cards. So, like, it kind of has that weird thing where as she upgrades... Here, I can get you to her again. As she upgrades, she kind of just turns into, like, the people she's playing with. So in 2 players, odds are you're going to be more what your other teammate is for their class. In 4 players, you kind of have a bit more to eat because you will eat other players' cards. You will. It's going to happen. I might have eaten Duke the Dog. I might have. But yeah, so, again, the deck list is down in the description. It's kind of hard to showcase, this deck in one image because it is a 50-card deck. But as you can see here, pretty simple on the skill side, pretty simple on the event side, and also still relatively simple on the asset side, but you can see kind of like where my thought process was for these other cards. So if you want to try this deck out, it's pretty simple. Draw cards, play assets when you're weak, and then eat those assets when you're strong and just go nuts. And that's Suzi. Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of different things you can do with it, and I am going to try to explore Suzi more, but this deck is basically just as simple as I summed it up. This is an asset-based Suzi, where it's about staying in your Ravenous as long as you can. There's a lot of other cool tricks that you can do, like the ARKHAM Pete had a jury rig, and, eat jury rigs once they're empty. Basically, anything that goes in play that you can use and then eat is really good in Suzi, I think. And that's that. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's pretty quick, but pretty simple. It's just a nice, yummy tummy Suzi deck. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good one, and as always, GG's.